Hello, class. Welcome to your first class in the International Experience in Marketing. This is the class you'll be finishing up before we arrive in London. I want to start by talking a little bit about the importance of international marketing. It's important for you to know that international marketing helps companies reach their full potential and maximize return for their stockholders. Of course, not all companies are in a position to take advantage of international markets, but very small companies to extremely large companies can do so. Many companies find that to keep up with competition, they have to reach for new international customers. So, one of the things you'll hear if you listen to market news at all is discussions about companies going overseas into new markets in order to help businesses grow or continue growing. For a lot of companies, an international presence is critical for their success. We think of companies like Exxon, General Motors, Apple, Microsoft, Mitsubishi. All of these are companies that earn profits higher than the gross domestic products of many low-income countries. These companies have the prosperity of countries, entire countries. Many small businesses can also attribute their success and even survival to international markets. Ironically, Northeast Ohio is a company because of its manufacturing expertise that has many small to medium sized enterprises that are thriving in international markets. Companies with products in late stages of the product life cycle also find that emerging markets are important for them. If we think about the product life cycle, and all of you should be familiar with that, that's the idea that a product has a life. There's an introductory stage, a growth stage, a maturity stage, and then a decline stage. Often when companies have products that are in that decline stage, they can extend the product life cycle by going to international markets. Also, privatization in countries where governments have historically had monopolies have made it possible for multinationals to compete for local energy, airlines, railways, telecommunications companies. So we see many countries, small countries, that have made a choice to privatize different pieces of their industries. And in many cases, large multinational corporations have come in and taken control of some of those. Also, in terms of the importance of international markets, for U.S. companies, 75% of the total world market for goods and services is outside of the United States. Coca-Cola earns 75% of its operating income and two-thirds of profit outside of North America. For Japanese companies, 90% of total world market is outside of the country, and for German countries, it's 94%. That's pretty amazing, and that really speaks to the importance of international markets. There's different levels of internationalization and international involvement that companies can choose to engage in. The weakest of these would be simply operating in a domestic environment and not moving international at all. And the strongest of these would be global. So as we talk about domestic, expert, international, and global orientations, we're talking about degrees of commitment to international marketing. And we'll talk about each of these. So in terms of domestic marketing, in that case, that's a very low level of commitment to international marketing. The focus of the firm is on selling to domestic customers only in the home country environment. That's a company that's really decided not to get involved outside of the U.S. market. In some cases, it may be because they have a product they simply don't see demand for outside the U.S. In many cases, it's because it's a smaller, relatively new product that doesn't have, or company that doesn't have the resources or doesn't think it has the resources to export. A company engaged in export marketing is a firm that's either indirectly or directly involved in selling its products overseas. The firm views the international market as an extension of the domestic market. All they're doing is taking existing product they've created for the U.S. market and selling it overseas in another market. They're not really modifying that product for an international market at all. In international marketing, it's a little bit different. The firm will focus on international consumers in one or more countries. The firm will actually have either sales offices or subsidiaries, perhaps joint ventures in different countries. In fact, a classic example of this would be many of the companies that have gone into China have gone in with joint ventures. And in fact, recently on NPR, there was a radio program about Google getting very involved in the Chinese market with a discussion about the fact that it may be in anticipation of self-driving cars in the next 5 to 10 to 15 years. In the case of international marketing, we also have international activities that are not coordinated across different countries. So we tend to see the company acting pretty independently in one country versus another country versus another country. It's not a coordinated event or activity. And then finally, we have global marketing. Global marketing, I really want to focus here on the marketing aspect. In the case of global marketing, the firm is coordinating its marketing activities across different countries without focusing primarily on national or regional segmentation. This strategy is probably possible due to the emergence of what we're calling global consumer segments. And that might be segments, for example, of young affluent professionals who seem to behave quite similarly across the world, across the globe. The strategy here entails an efficient global allocation of company resources and unified approaches to segments. So what we're trying to do is take advantage of economies of scale in terms of things like our communications because we see this segment that is identifiable across nations. So again, this just kind of summarizes or captures level of international marketing involvement. So we've got domestic marketing, export marketing, international marketing, and then global marketing. And the focus of domestic marketing is on that domestic market. In export marketing, we're either directly or indirectly exporting our product, but we're not really making a strong international commitment and we're not modifying our product for overseas sales. In international marketing, we're making a substantial international commitment and we're focusing on countries or regions other than our own. We may find ourselves making modifications not just to product but also to the messaging and the marketing communications that we make. In global marketing, that's the highest level of commitment to international marketing, and that's a focus on market segments rather than countries or regions, and those are segments that transcend country boundaries. Okay. When we talk about level of international involvement, we can also think in terms of the company's philosophy or philosophy on or towards international involvement. And that can be termed as ethnocentric. Imagine they're centric actually at the underneath, underneath each one of these different terms. So ethnocentric, polycentric, region-centric, and geocentric. And ethnocentric is the lowest level of commitment or involvement with international markets, and geocentric is the highest. I'm going to describe each one of these for you now, and they correspond quite a bit to these different levels of international marketing involvement. Okay, an ethnocentric orientation is when we've got domestic strategies, techniques, and personnel, and the way companies tend to think about it is our way is right. Unfortunately, Americans actually have something of a reputation for taking that approach. The American way is right. And that makes us very ethnocentric in orientation. And not all companies are like this, not all people are like this, but in the past we have had something of a reputation, as have some other countries as well. International markets are viewed as secondary. They're regarded primarily as outlets for surplus domestic production. International marketing plans are developed in-house by the international division if there is one. And one of the examples I had here, although it's not really a good example of an ethnocentric orientation, or at least it isn't anymore, is Disney resorts in Paris. So, for example, the Disney resorts in Paris initially, it is it is in many respects exporting American culture. That's what Disney does. But one of the challenges Disney in Paris faced was following a policy that works quite well in the US of not selling alcohol in most of its restaurants. And because the attitude towards alcohol is so different in France, it's considered a normal part of a lunch or dinner meal. They actually ended up eventually having to change that policy because our way was not the right way for France. A polycentric orientation is really a case where we've got focus on the importance of identifying the uniqueness of each international market. So we're actually looking for what those differences are, looking for the uniqueness and trying to address that in our products and our approaches to those markets. A company may establish independent businesses in each target country or loosely controlled businesses in each target country. Often they will actually acquire an existing business in a target country in order to achieve international presence. In those cases, those organizations tend to be fully decentralized with very little coordination with headquarters. The marketing strategies are specific to each country. So while it has the advantage of having strategies that will speak to or work within the constraints and the situation in a country, there are some downsides. As an outcome of that independent approach, there are no economies of scale. You get duplication of functions, and you tend to have higher final product costs. Regiocentric orientation considers world regions that share either economic, political, and/or cultural traits as distinct markets. So, for example, we often lump North America together. That would be Canada and the U.S. We often lump South America together, which is a number of different countries in South America. Divisions are organized based on locations, as well as cultural and political traits. Regional offices tend to coordinate marketing activities using a region-wide marketing approach. Just as an example, there's a famous local tire company that has offices in South America and offices in Africa. They have one office in each of those continents, and that one office actually coordinates for the continent, not just the country they're in, but the entire continent. Sorry. Some examples of regional brands would be things like Unilever's Domestos, which is household cleaning agents containing bleach that are sold in Central Europe. I do want to point out that Central Europe tends to be viewed quite differently from Western Europe. So when we say Central Europe, sorry, my mouse is behaving badly. When we say Western Europe, we're talking about countries like Germany and Scandinavian countries tend to be lumped in there as well. The United Kingdom, Ireland, France, Germany. When we talk about Central Europe, we tend to be talking about other countries such as Poland, the Czech Republic, and so on. A geocentric orientation looks at marketing strategies aimed towards, again, market segments rather than geographic locations. It's maximizing efficiencies worldwide and providing a product that's predictable and standardized across countries and throughout the world. As an example, we have products like Visa. Visa is sold everywhere around the world and tends to use very similar advertising globally. We can also think of other products like any Apple product that tends to have a geocentric orientation. I also want to point out that there are factors that will influence the adoption of international business and a drive towards international business. The major drivers of that would include things like competition, regional economic and political integration, innovation, economic growth, and converging consumer needs. I'm going to talk about each one of these briefly. In terms of competition, what tends to happen is a company starts to feel competitive pressure from international companies that are coming into their home markets. And that really forces the company to expand into new markets, often even less profitable ones. So, for example, going back to tires, you had companies like Michelin, a French company, entering the US market many, many years ago, putting pressure on US manufacturers like Dunlop or Goodyear or Goodrich, and those companies in return expanding into other international markets. So, competitive pressure is a common driver of international business expansion. Another would be regional economic and political integration. This is actually a pretty hot topic right now in the presidential debates for the nominations for each party. In this case, integrating facilitates international trade for companies in member countries and for companies from countries outside the area. So, for example, right now, going outside the US, we currently have a debate going on among some EU countries about whether or not they want to remain in the European Union. And really, the country that's in question right now is the United Kingdom. And hopefully, while we are in London, we will be able to get more information about how people feel about either remaining in the EU or leaving the EU. Being a member country in the European Union has enormous advantages from a trade perspective. It allows free trade across borders. It also allows free movement of people across borders. And that's one of the issues I think that's driving reconsideration for the UK right now. In the US, we have things like NAFTA. Regional agreements like NAFTA or Mercosur, I'm not sure I'm saying that right, these will lower or eliminate barriers and promote trade within these markets. Subsidiaries can be established in these markets to take advantage of free trade within the region. That has been an issue in our U.S. political campaigns. So, for example, I believe that Hillary Clinton's taking a fair bit of criticism for her support of NAFTA. And NAFTA has been controversial, there's no question. Additional trade agreements are being contemplated by the Obama administration, and people want to know where the candidates stand on those, and people want to know more details about those, not surprisingly. Most economists believe that that kind of regional economic and political integration provides greater political stability and opportunity for economic development. And again, most economists believe that regional globalization of business is inevitable and desirable in order to raise the living standard of the world. The problem is that many individuals, at least here in the US, feel that they have been disadvantaged by international trade. Innovation is another factor that really drives international business. When we've got new technologies, they may allow companies to reach a larger audience. For example, technology allows us to advertise in ways that we weren't able to before, that allow us to communicate with international markets at relatively low manageable costs. Media such as the internet allow even small and medium-sized enterprises from either high or low-income countries to gain international exposure that simply wasn't possible in the past. Just as an example, I have a new or a relatively new cover for the laptop I'll be bringing with me. I ordered it on Amazon and only realized after it looked like it was going to take 3 weeks to get to me that I was ordering from a company, and probably a fairly small company, in China, and that the product was being made to my specification and shipped to me from China. It was pretty amazing. Also, in terms of innovation, cheaper and more efficient forms of transportation and telecommunications make international trade and international business more viable, more profitable. So lower cost, higher quality communications due to satellite technology, teleconferencing, emailing, all of that has really revolutionized international business. Economic growth is something virtually every economy seeks, every government seeks. And economic growth creates markets of high potential for international brands while also opening up previously closed markets. We have markets like India and like Brazil and like China that have emerging middle classes with increasing buying power. And they're big markets, they're huge markets. We also have the opening of new markets that were previously closed completely. China was a closed market for a long time. It really opened up in the 70s and even more so in the 80s. Vietnam is opening, but Vietnam is still a very closed market. I would say it's one of the most closed markets still existing in Southeast Asia, Cambodia and Vietnam. The former Eastern Bloc countries, again, the Czech Republic, Poland, there's a handful of countries there that were closed at one time. They were under Soviet Union control and they were centrally planned economies. And those countries have become open markets and operate under the same kind of economy that neighboring countries operate under. Okay, another driver towards international business is converging consumer needs. Consumers are exposed through media or travel to global brands, and they create demand for global products and worldwide loyalty to international brands. So, for example, we have brands like Apple and the iPhone that have strong loyalty across markets. We have that kind of loyalty for auto manufacturers like Ford. There's huge markets globally for Ford cars and other cars that the U.S. makes. We also have the emergence of these uniform consumer segments that really seem to be quite similar regardless of language, regardless of culture, regardless of country. So when you are in London, especially, you'll be meeting people from around the world, and you'll find that the people in your age group, your cohort, aren't really that different from you in many respects. We see groups that we refer to as global teenagers or the global elite that really have very similar buying behaviors. Okay, firm specific. So we talked about general conditions that will drive companies towards global market entry and globalization. There's also firm specific drivers of international expansion. And those tend to fall under the following categories: product life cycle, high new product development costs, standardization, economies of scale, cheap labor, and experience transfers. I'm going to talk about each one of these briefly. First is the product life cycle. This should look familiar to you. When we talk about the product life cycle, again, we talk about that cycle of introduction, growth, maturity, and decline in terms of sales and profits. And companies that are in the maturity or decline stage of the product life cycle will often breathe new life into their products by entering new markets. So if you think about, for example, a manufacturer of something like refrigerators, the U.S. market for refrigerators is steady, but it's definitely in the maturity stage. We can get new traction in that market by expanding into countries or regions that are experiencing fast economic growth with that growing middle class. And it's because of that growing middle class you'll find people interested in buying refrigerators. And of course, implied there is the availability of the electricity and the availability of disposable income that allows for the purchase of something like a refrigerator. High new product development costs also require that a company try to get as much sales as possible. So when we talk about new product development costs, we know that they're increasing rapidly. And at the same time, product life cycles are decreasing. They're getting shorter and shorter. So my costs are going up, and the time over which I can recoup my costs is getting shorter and shorter. So firms are looking beyond the home country to make full recovery on high product development costs and to become profitable more rapidly. Oops, hang on just a minute, sorry. Okay. Standardization scales, scales of economy, and cheap labor. All of these have to do with driving down costs. In every one of these cases, what we find is that price competition, especially during the maturity or decline stages of the product life cycle, drives the firm to try to find new ways to make their products at a lower cost, and the firm is able to lower costs and prices if it can take advantage of economies of scale, and that's just the idea that the more I produce, the cheaper each unit of production is. Standardization that allows me to standardize the product in some way so I can get better economies of scale, and the idea that cheap labor is available globally. And I may be able to move production or parts of production or parts of my service, what sometimes referred to offshore or overseas, in order to reduce my costs. And then finally, experience transfers. The idea here is that if I have expanded internationally into other markets, I've learned something from that experience. And as a result, it's easier for me and less expensive for me to generalize that knowledge into another part of the world. Okay, there are obstacles to international expansion. These include things like self-reference criteria. And this is the idea that either consciously or unconsciously we think of our own culture and home country norms when we're trying to operate in another country. And that can really be a stumbling block for us and prevent us from adapting to local businesses and actually focusing on the needs of local consumers. Remember the refrigerators I was mentioning? There was a major US manufacturer who decided to enter China very early in the early 80s, and they decided that they would export US refrigerators to China. And of course, US refrigerators were almost the size of the average Chinese apartment at that time. They were huge in very small spaces. And keep in mind that energy is much cheaper in the US than it is anywhere else in the world. So that didn't work out. They were thinking of what we in the US want instead of what would work best for people in China. To counter the impact of self-referencing, companies are looking for adaptable personnel for international assignments and trying to sensitize expatriates to the local culture. What many companies are also doing, especially once they have a foot on the ground, is they're hiring more people from the home country and having fewer expatriates involved with the company. We also see government barriers to entry into international markets or international expansion. In that case, what we're talking about are things like restrictions placed on international corporations by imposing tariffs, import quotas, other limitations, for example, restrictive import licenses, or some kind of very specific criteria for a product being imported. We also have barriers imposed by international competition. In that case, what's happening is the companies that we are actually facing as competition will take steps to block our entry or to make our entry less successful. So a company may block our channels of distribution. If there's a competitor that has strong relationships in a country, they could have the power to block channels of distribution. They may have exclusive retailer agreements that preclude your product from being sold in retail space. Companies may also engage in price cutting. By the way, we see that here in the US domestically as well as overseas. So if we try to enter an international market, a foreign competitor or an international competitor may cut their price to make our new entrant into the market less desirable. And then finally, advertising can be used as a barrier to entry. So, as we're entering an international market, successful companies operating within that market might really extend or expand their advertising expenditures. One of the things I want you to be working on over the course of the next 2 weeks, and more generally in your lives as business majors, in your lives as human beings, is becoming more globally aware. And what that means is to become more objective and more tolerant of cultural differences. I like to say that culture is transparent until you leave your own culture and enter someone else's culture. We don't really understand how pervasive and how all encompassing culture is until we're transplanted into another culture. And all of a sudden, things that we took for granted are not the same, they're different. So, unless you have had the experience of going from your home culture, the culture you were born and raised in, to another culture, you probably even aren't aware of how your own culture is affecting you and how that's affecting your response to cultural differences. So, work on becoming globally aware over the next few weeks and also become knowledgeable of different cultures, history, world market potentials, and global economic, social, and political trends. One of the things you'll need to do if you're sincerely interested in global business and global marketing is start paying attention to the news. Thank you.